episode of the Rabble Report. Today we have a very special guest, somebody who's influenced us and aided us on this journey through anti-politics. His name is David, live from Australia. Hi, David. How are you doing?
Hey, Joe. How are you?
Not too bad. We have a pretty notable week, actually. We have quite a few cabinet appointments that Trump is floating.
Do we want to start with Matt Gaetz for Attorney General? That's quite interesting.
That's quite a pick for an Attorney General, don't you think? If you look at the guy who looks shady, his little dalliances.
It'll be interesting to work out whether he's a disruptor in his role or whether he ends up being an enforcer of the usual state rationality, because it's a bit up in the air to me. His experience or claim, anyway, of the law being weaponized against him makes it interesting to see whether he'll have a disruptive effect. I just mean the way in which the state operates towards these particular areas of policy, as we've talked about many times before between us, often operates on not solving the problems that it's meant to be, or only administering the problems in certain kinds of ways. So if you have someone who comes in and wants to quote unquote solve a problem, even if it's a terrible, awful way that they want to solve it, the chaos that can cause, the disruption, that's what I'm talking about. It'll be interesting to see whether someone who, like Gaetz, who's experienced himself as being directly suffering weaponization of the law, what he does then with the powers of prosecution.
Whether Gaetz is innocent or guilty, right? His perceived persecution by the state means that he's coming in with a very different agenda and orientation than any attorney general I can think of in recent history.
I agree with that, but there I do think it probably does matter whether he's guilty or not, actually, because it would still be disruptive, but it would determine, for example, whether or not he's more focused, for instance, on creating immunity
for himself.
Yeah, maybe for himself, but I'm also thinking in his role as a politician, for example.
I think what you said about the candidates more generally, even if you have a bad solution, your desire to solve the problem is disruptive. So I think you're right, David.
We've talked about with the deportation. Well, you can issue a edict that you're going to deport X amount of people, but if you don't have the actual staff to do it, it's not going to happen. Instead, what you might do is end up causing all sorts of chaos.
I was reading that Washington Examiner article about Homan and the extent to which the federal government could maybe deport 600,000 people in a year. So over the course of an entire term, that is up to what, 2.5 million? I think that kind of shows the limits of state capacity and actually what Trump could do.
Joe, what do you think of these cabinet appointees in general?
It's definitely a cross-section of where the Republican Party is at right now. You have somebody like Rubio, and Rubio is interesting to me, actually, because he's somebody that Trump and Christie, actually, they completely humiliated and embarrassed in 2016. And his relevance and his star kind of declined after that. But actually, Trump floated him as VP this year. I think what's happened, actually, since Trump turned him into a footstool is Rubio has, in his unceasing opportunism, moved towards what he kind of views as Trumpism. He's moderated a little bit on economic policy, that type of thing. I think this is very much Rubio kind of like, clawing up the greasy pole, and Trump willing to throw him a bone, but on his own terms. Who knows if he'll last, really? It'll be interesting if he joins like the Nikki Haley's of the world after this, or the Rex Tillersons. But
anyway, John Kelly types, yeah,
no, absolutely. So that's a good example, like an arch establishmentarian who was converted into furniture and has tried to make his peace with that. But then you have somebody like Gaetz, who Gaetz is definitely a product of the new Republican Party. Somebody that's strange, I don't think would have ever gotten anywhere close to where he's gotten without Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, even looking at the guy, he looks like an apartheid diamond dealer, right? Like, would you trust a man with that forehead? I wouldn't. But that being said,
well, I mean, we had plenty of politicians with similar life stories, perhaps, but to have it be so on the surface,
it's very on the surface, and He looks sleazy in that very specifically Floridian way. Like,
Matt Gaetz, sort of in the Gavin Newsom, maybe this is a bit horseshoe theory, right? But Matt Gaetz could be a RoboCop villain, as could Gavin Newsom.
absolutely. Absolutely.
There is
But,
something very 80s villain, actually. You could actually, there's something 80s villain about him, isn't there? You know? Anyway.
I do think that this is overall, it does seem like a cross section of the Republican Party's confusion where it's at right now, and Trump's horse trading and personal dealings with that, and probably his own paranoia. Even the extent to which now Tulsi Gabbard's running the DNI, and that's created all these conniption fits about how Trump is going to hand American intelligence to all of our adversaries. And this is a day ago, they were saying that, that Trump was going to be a hyper neocon who was going to blow up the world. There's a lot of narrative confusion right now. Personally, I tend to think it's going to resemble his first term quite a bit, where he's going to attempt transactional foreign policy in his own wacky way. And whether or not it succeeds depends on several factors.
In addition to Tulsi Gabbard, we had some announcements around Elon Musk and Vivek. So do we think that the Department of Government Efficiency,
which is not going to be a department of the government, which is interesting. That's what's most interesting to me about it.
Right. Which I understand why Elon Musk would like that, right? But it seems like it's being head up by both Elon Musk and Vivek. And then also, it's interesting, right? It puts them in a position where they make these probably non-binding recommendations, which on the one hand, you don't have a lot of power. On the other hand, you don't have a lot of responsibility. So I'm curious about it, whether it really manifests into anything or not.
Do you mean if it's just a glorified blue ribbon commission? I've wondered about that myself, really. I'm very skeptical the extent to which you're going to gut the administrative state. That's been an ambition of Trump's going back to Bannon, really. But the extent to which you could actually do it.
This going to the point about disruption, I don't see how it can't be disruptive to have a government portfolio or agency that's run both internally. It still would be a its own government portfolio internally, but also effectively has its secretary actually positioned outside the government. I'm curious to see how that operates in terms of implementation of policy. There's more capacity and autonomy for Musk, for instance, to sort of unilaterally declare that X or Y function of the state is going to be defunded or has to be radically pared back in terms of its regulations. And whether or not that goes ahead, I would just find it interesting because there's no way that can't be disruptive. I don't see how that couldn't be disruptive. It just seems like there's more of a capacity for that to happen, for better or worse.
Its vague status as whether it's a state institution or a civil society institution is really interesting.
There's something more parastate-like though to it, I think, more predominantly. A member of the political class outside the political state. I don't think, for instance, Musk is going to be super representative of civil society in these decisions. Said that though, Musk himself, he's represented as if he's, I don't know, you would think he was one of these sort of railroad tycoons from like the turn of the 19th century or something, kind of like, and simply he's not. His overall, for want of a better term, social conscience is certainly not anything like it's presented on the left, where you would think he was just a raging, rampaging, totally monstrously asocial villain. What's the name of his satellite system again?
Starlink.
Yeah, he's willing to just supply that in disaster recovery. Not
only does Musk supply Starlink in disaster recovery, he also supplies it to Ukraine, which is very interesting. Yeah. I mean, the orientation of the new administration towards Ukraine is not black and white. And the orientation of even somebody like Elon Musk, who I think wants a peace deal pretty fast, even the orientation of Ukrainian politicians towards the election was not black and white. I mean, there was an article that came out recently that said a lot of Ukrainian politicians, and maybe this is by a lot, I don't necessarily mean a majority, but there was a substantial faction of Ukrainian politicians who were hoping for a Trump victory over Biden, just to have some change.
Well, I honestly think that one of the most interesting developments out of this actually is to see now what happens to Zelensky as a anti-politician who has been gone into like kind of like locked up deep freeze as due to the fact of the war. Now it's interesting because like he's going to have to reorientate himself towards Trump. There's no doubt about that, and or else he's going to. I think he's going to fall afoul of the anti-Ukrainian bloc in the party as it currently exists. You can call it a bloc. I think it'd be more incoherent than that. So the thing about Zelensky will be interesting to see here is like whether, because the thing is, I actually do think there's a great possibility for Zelensky. He might be able to sweet talk Trump. He might be able to charm him. But at the same time, true, Trump's got his number as well. Quite well, that was that funny thing that Trump said, praising him as like the businessman of the century, because every time he comes to the United States, he walks away with X billion amount of dollars. But what I'm thinking is, there's something about that though that's like, if Zelensky kind of gets that he should deal with Trump exactly on that level where Trump will say shit like that, there's a good possibility he's going to actually make a friend of Trump. I think what Trump definitely wants is the kudos of being able to like bring the conflict to an end. That's no doubt about that. What does it even mean, for example, for Ukraine to have like a complete victory in this war? Even if you were to imagine something like that, it would have to be internal to Russia, surely. It would be something like, for example, the regime collapsing because the war had gone on so long. It's not like military power is going to be able to
drive the Russians out of, yeah.
Well, and even if they did, what I'm saying, say if they did drive them across the border again, right? Okay, so you drive them up to the border, and even if you do drive, I mean, assuming it's a bit of a different story too, if you've driven them out of your country completely and then you cross the border into theirs, different from the way in which they've already crossed the border into Russia. I mean, it was a daring, dangerous move, but also, insofar particularly as it worked, it's smart because it also to actually give them leverage for getting back territory. But it would be a different story altogether if you've driven Russia out and then you cross the border after them. And of course, if you stop at the border, the question is, well, if the war's not over, well, what's to stop Russia regrouping and reinvading? If all you can do is just push the troops to the border, but you can never actually crush the army itself, there's no particular way to deal a devastating, crushing blow to the Russian army, not because of its particular superiority, but simply because there's the sheer resources and numbers. It's always been an advantage for Russia just to have sheer numbers on its side. Even with the strain internally for Putin and I think this is probably the worst thing for him of the war, the thing that's been most destructive for him as being the fact that he's having to make demands upon civil society in Russia, such as it is, that the whole reason that Putin's been able to command as much of a hegemony as he has is exactly because there hasn't been a need to call out or politicize society in this way. The longer the war goes on, the more it has to rope in manpower to fight it. Putin wouldn't be doing things like drawing on prison populations in order to populate the roles, or mercenaries in the first place. Why would you even need to draw on those if you could rely on your civilian population to...
Right. And the thing is, too, I've noticed in recent polling, there's not a majority yet, but nearly half of Ukrainians are actually starting to become open to territorial concessions at this point. There's now war exhaustion on the Ukrainian end.
I think it's important because obviously Zelensky, in terms of the weird thing is, people forget too, Zelensky himself, right before all this began, when he first met Putin, was interested in doing a deal with him. Like, this is all forgotten. And Putin was the one who actually sunk it, right? Because Putin, I mean, the whole war really in some ways for Putin, it's not about Ukraine, it's about him, really, more than anything else. It's about how dare the Ukrainian public elect Zelensky to power,
People forget that Zelensky, even though he's become this wartime figure that is a little bit stuck in a role, perhaps a role he has to play that the West and Russia both impose in certain senses, that's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to break out of. He was an anti-politician in a very stark way. I mean, this is someone who was
Well, I would say personally, I'd say he was the most radical anti-politician that's emerged so far, up until the point that the war started.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I mean, what was his? He was a comedian on a television show about a teacher that ran for that ran to be president of Ukraine. Then he
Have
did.
you ever watched it, by the way?
It's
I
hilarious.
keep meaning to. I'm sure it's good. Yeah,
It's hilarious. It is.
okay. I'm sure it's very interesting. Actually,
There's a surreal quality that it has now as well, that he is actually the president of Ukraine. But even
Right.
outside of that, it's almost a piece of art about anti-politics as well.
I definitely could see like Zelensky as an example of the most radical anti-politician that emerged yet, and maybe that's
Now,
what
a war
war.
can mess that up.
Well, like all
Yeah.
anti-politicians, though, the thing is that depending on the circumstances, right, they can be overwhelmed by events. Trump, it happened with COVID / the lockdowns, which he was instrumental in introducing, and it would have destroyed him completely if he'd kept on in that, if he'd been stuck, aligned in consensus with the establishment around that up and through the election of 2020. For Zelensky, it's turned out to be the war, the invasion.
Sorry, do you think Zelensky would be able to salvage himself on this?
On the war, you mean? Like,
Yeah.
would he be able to repivot? It's not been a case, for example, that like he simply just had the backing of the West, and that basically they've been driving the war. The West has been a lot more ambivalent than that, and so in order to shore up the Ukrainian side, he's had to actually leverage the internal contradictions of particularly European politics to compel from them a more resolute stand that I think otherwise they would have adopted. But on the other hand, of course, you also have the sense in which, under the Biden administration, that they were going to prosecute the war to the point where the timing of the end of the war is not going to be based on the Ukrainian, viewpoint about when that should or shouldn't happen.
There's a simultaneous Western ambivalence about funding the war, and then at the same time, the political class swings between seeing the war in Ukraine as a burden that they need to discard at any cost, or not at any cost, but at great cost to Ukraine. And then also seeing the war as a potential existential threat to the Putin regime in Russia, and even being willing to drag this thing on as a sort of attrition damage against the Russian state. Which,
well, I think that like there's just struck me as being like a US thing about not just US, but European as well. The British, for example, like a big. They're probably even more radical because they're not the ones that think. They're probably even more radical on this than the United States. But basically, understanding that the war is this suppurating wound. The longer you can keep that suppurating wound open for Russia, the more and more over time it's going to damage and deteriorate its very fledgling great power status as it is. I mean, it's only, despite the fact that the sanctions have not worked at least in the way that they are often spooked as having worked. There always seems to be I'll just let them go a bit longer and they'll do their job. I also don't believe they've had no effect either. And the overall signs, for example, that the Russian economy's managed to keep standing, foundations of that are not based on stone. For instance, if China, for whatever reason, right, reorientates, it doesn't even have to reorient in the sense of turning against Russia. All it has to do is just become lukewarm rather than positively willing in its terms of trade to firm up Russia. I think the main interest out of the White House, for example, unlike out of Britain and whatever the case might be, is there's a tendency to want to push or just to keep this thing going, right, under the terms that it currently exists, exactly because it's irresolvable, right? The person that poses the biggest problem to is Putin. It would only be a problem from the perspective of the White House if, for example, the Ukrainians collapsed on themselves. As long as you can keep them shored up, strong enough anyway to maintain attrition. And I think that's partly why there's this wrangle backwards and forwards between Zelensky and the White House and with Europe. Because on the one hand, I do think that they are definite hawks among them. They're often crazier than anything that Zelensky has ever said. If you believe what some of them were advocating for, I'm certain they would end up starting World War III. I think the thing about Zelensky in this sense is like he's been dealing with an orientation towards the war that's actually at loggerheads, whereas he wants to expel Russia and get the best terms he can in terms of the kind of peace he can get for the Ukraine and a secure, like, I mean, I think this is why victory matters to him in this sense. Say you got a compromise, but effectively Ukraine is in a constant precarious situation where it could be invaded again at a later time. I think that's partly why this idea of victory is something to do with this, about some guarantee or some means of striking a blow on Russia that would solve for that. I don't really see how militarily that actually could be achieved. So when Zelensky's gone to Washington or was spoken in Europe, in some sense, he's pushing to commit more than they would because he's wanting to fight it to win it. Let's put it that way. And I don't necessarily think that they are willing necessarily to fund it to win it. I think they're willing to fund it to fight it, basically, and to fight it, and to fight it, and to fight it. And similarly, I think also to even those who are quite more, like, at least you would think they're personally sincere, there's also the element too that, yes, they want to fight Russia, right? But they like that as an idea in the ether. They want to do it on the cheap also too. Like, that's the thing. I know, we know what the political class is like, you know what I mean? Particularly the political state. They would want their cake and eat it too. Yes, we want to fight Russia, but we also don't want to spend money. So we'll do it as cheaply as we possibly can, would be the thing. And so that's the other element I think he has to push and leverage back against this sort of
it kind of seems like I think that's kind of relates to what I was thinking here too. It seems like a lot of what this push and pull is about I think the West knows that it's weak, but it knows that Russia is also weak. Right.
And I think, and it's all about the comparative strength, right? That's the thing, is that, so there's temptations, of course, there's hubris, you know, I mean, whether or not, for example, the West has the capacity, right, to be able to fund an ongoing war of attrition at this level of expense in the Ukraine without causing, like, the havoc that it's already caused or contributed or added to in terms of domestic economies and whatever, who knows? How long can Russia hold out? Putin's got more flesh in the game when it comes to holding this out, because he doesn't have very many exits, really, does he?
Where does it leave Putin? Say the different Trump compromises and endings that are really plausible at this point. I'm curious where it leaves Putin, especially long term.
If Zelensky was to become reanimated as an anti-political figure, this conflict gets treated as being this insoluble mess. But in actual fact, it seems to me the biggest problem would be Putin, actually. Right? It seems like it's the only solution that I could really see. And it seems also straightforward, which is basically to meet with Putin and say, here are the terms that we're going to accept. We're going to allow you to have the Crimea, and you're going to buy it from us. Now, you're not going to buy it at just at a market value price, as it were, or whatever. You're also going to buy it, right, factoring in the indemnity that you owe us to rebuild our country. But therefore, you won't have to pay reparations directly, and you don't have that internal, albatross. But you will be paying us for the damage that you've done by buying the Crimea from us. You're returning the territory that you've taken otherwise, that you supposedly annexed and whatever. That I don't care if it's in the Constitution, returning those, and we're returning your territory to you. The question would be, why would Putin accept this? And I'd say, well, the thing about this is that no one's ever going to recognize, internationally speaking, even countries like China and whatever, they construct neutrality, but they won't necessarily recognize the legitimate right for Russia to claim as its territory the Crimea. But if you strike a deal with Ukraine and Ukraine itself recognizes it, then there's no longer an issue about its international illegality. So that's why also too, you have to leave, right, the other parts of our territory that you've invaded, because we're not going to recognize that as not illegal, and for good reason. Whereas with the Crimea, it literally is debatable. It was once considered to be part, insofar as these things matter, it was considered part of Russia territorially.
Do you think Putin would recognize ceding the Donetsk and Luhansk regions?
That would probably be the most complicated part of the whole thing. Again, I think that's what I tend to think, is that basically, again, the same principle could apply. Well, if it literally was that he was not pushable on it, then you can buy it from us, is what the thing I'd probably stress the most. But with those regions, right, I think the thing about it is more than anything else, I would be pushing for Ukrainian and Russians that live in the region to both have full dual nationality, so that they have the freedom to be able to effectively choose which country they want to live in, and also to effectively would create that zone of civil society. It wouldn't actually be simply because of their nationality. It doesn't matter if Ukraine's actually the administrative government of it. The fact that they are both Ukrainian nationals and Russian nationals, I think would make a qualitative difference to the way in which they were able to be ruled.
That actually doesn't sound so bad.
Exactly. What it does is it cuts against the politics, right? It sounds to me like when I was thinking about what the anti-political solution to the problem would be. The only one I've even seen mention the idea that it could be a transactional purchase is Stephen Kotkin, the guy writing that biography of Stalin, that 3-volume biography. He's a Harvard anti-communist, right-leaning, hawkish guy, but he's come up with the most sensible, like he's the only one who said the most sensible idea in relation to the whole thing all along. I don't know. Anyway.
Well, the integration of, first of all, the purchase has a symbolic value that's actually pretty important. And then on top of that, having any kind of dual citizenship just really makes it complicated to invade again. I mean, it just, anything that complicates the politics of reinvading and ending up exactly where we are again is a step forward in the whole situation. I mean, and if there's ambiguity, right, this is an interesting thing, right? People think in very black and white terms. Okay, if there's ambiguity about what state owns this territory, then we've got to have a war and resolve it. Well, actually, if the ambiguity is baked into the status of whatever region we're talking about, that can have its own benefits, actually. Yeah. Because you're acknowledging the reality of the situation, and the historical ambiguity is a part of how we treat it today, rather than being something that needs to be fought over.
The tricky part with the so-called breakaway regions, they're fully a case of annexation of territory that was foreign, at least at undercurrent orders.
We're talking about a second place option, right? The first ideal option is Crimea is treated in this way. If we get to this point, then the ambiguity I'm talking about is, in all honesty, an ambiguity that's imposed by the Russian invasion recently. Whereas with Crimea, we're talking about something that's more historically rooted. But I'm saying, unfortunately, if Russia won't budge, then their assertion of the ambiguity, whether it's true or not, is there.
I mean, there are possible things too. Like, I don't know exactly to what extent you actually could get one that was actually practically free. But obviously, one of the things you would leverage, for instance, is if you were in that situation before you gave it up, would say, we'll have a referendum in the territories to decide where they can decide. We'll have a referendum on the matter. Now, of course, like I said, whether or not you could have a free referendum, that's a tricky question. But I think at the very least, that's something you would push if you were in a position where you were going to lose them anyway. It'd be very hard to say no to it, at the very least, of putting on the show of having done one. And if you said yes to it, I don't think it would be very credible unless it was internationally monitored or internationally administered. The other thing too, of course, as well, is quite obviously Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. If Putin cared so much about it, you would think that what's happened since, right, in terms of like Finland, like, we'd already be plunged into World War III, which just goes to show you the extent to which it was manipulated and used by him. But it's not. But what was most so effective about that was that it was completely and utterly accurate. Like, in terms of, like, it was always what he could go. He could always fall back on that as a justified means to advance pretty much his intimidation of the former Soviet states. Ukraine can't be part of NATO. But then I always find it weird. There's this conflation of NATO and the EU. I'm quite positive that the majority of Ukrainians want to be in the EU because they want to leave the country, right? They want to be able to get out of the country, right? They want, and more importantly too, not even just permanently, they want to go and make money elsewhere and come back also potentially too. The orientation towards Europe, culturally and socially and economically, that is somehow mixed up with NATO. And it's like, well, you know what, like fighting for being part of the EU, like it'd be if the Ukrainian political class had actually been pushing to be part of the EU without and being very staunch about getting against NATO, like I think that would have probably been the worst of both worlds for Putin, because he really wouldn't have the same leg to stand on if it was purely the EU that they ended up joining and not NATO. So I just sort of think to myself, like the guarantee, maybe as part of the guarantee, we won't join NATO. We'll give you a full-fledged guarantee, but you have to accept that we're going to join the EU. I think that would probably be popular in terms of winning over Ukrainians too, particularly because I imagine giving up territory, regardless of whether it's practical or not, if it's might be in terms of people's opinion on it, they just might not like the idea. It's as simple as that. You know, I don't think I would like it particularly if I was, whether or not I thought it had to happen. I don't think I would like it. And I wouldn't and I might possibly punish the politician that did it, even if I did agree that they had to be done.
I kind of wonder actually if it's even sustainable. Really, can you really integrate into Europe on that level and not fall under its military chassis? It's a good question. What do you think the effects of this would be? Because I'm guessing the Trump administration would be pretty heavily involved in any of this deal making. How do you think this would affect his authority or his standing politically? Because I feel like this would, if he manages to solve this, I imagine it would be a pretty massive boost.
Oh, it would be huge. It would be like that. Also, Israel Palestine, if he managed to do something on that as well, like all of these.
I guess I've wondered too. With that, I know that Trump has been interested in talking to Iran, and I've wondered if that actually could potentially pincer both Israel and Hamas. Probably because I can imagine like Iran might be willing to cut Hamas loose at this point, and Hamas seems to have fatally eroded a lot of its support, at least in Gaza. I'm not sure about the West Bank right now, but definitely Gaza. And I wonder if isolating Hamas might be willing to do that, really, as far as like getting back into some sort of speaking relationship with the United States, really. Because the Biden administration seemed to fail at that. The Biden administration seemed to be very, they didn't seem to be willing to actually compromise with the Iranians. Iran. It's interesting. We have seen Iran's regional power conceits have actually been pretty swiftly wrecked by this war. They seem overextended. Hezbollah got decapitated in a lot of ways. Hamas is pretty effectively decapitated. It seems Iran has been compromised, actually. They're definitely crawling with Israeli intelligence at high levels. And recently they elected a reformist president. It seems very obviously both a signal from the mullahs that they're willing to talk to the United States and from the public telling them to slow down on the hardliner foreign adventure posture. Well, my question is, Trump is often portrayed as like an extreme hawk on Iran, and he has been tough on them. But he has also floated reining them into the Abraham Accords, from what I remember. And he's also signaled both a willingness to bomb the crap out of them or talk to them. I feel like he wants to pull a Kim with them, if he can. My question is that going to happen? What are the possible pitfalls of this? Who's going to obstruct it? And how does this affect the Israel-Hamas conflict? A lot to unpack here.
In a way, this is an example of how, even with Israel, Trump sort of giving the right what they want moves things weirdly forward in a way. I mean, we've reached this point now where rather than Israel and Gaza being in this eternal low-level struggle, things just sort of erupted, right? And it's been a really brutal conflict. I'm not sure I'm saying it's a good thing, but more from just a neutral analytical perspective. A lot of, I think, Trump's deal making in the Middle East during his first term, and then the adriftness of the Biden administration in the Middle East after that, it all sort of culminated in this in a way that has Israel's military superiority was already a factor before October 7th, right? But Hamas, for its own self-interested political reasons, enacts that. And then we get this brutal Israeli response, and sort of the implicit reality that was already there has now actually started to come into material reality in a way. Does that make sense? I mean, the balance of power that was latent in the situation between Israel and Gaza has now had to just sort of be realized. Am I being abstract? I mean, do you know what I mean?
No, I do know what you mean. It's sort of, well, I mean, ultimately, Israel's going to probably be occupying the Strip. There's nothing left at this point, so they're probably going to be drawing it up, throwing all sorts of like military boundaries, basically de facto villagizing people. That's from all the reading. That seems to be the post-war plan. People are going to get herded into these little parts of the Strip that are going to be cut off by military checkpoints and roads that allow easy military access, easy intelligence access, that type of thing. Basically, to prevent another October 7th. So there isn't a unified Strip anymore. The West Bank, that I feel like I'm a little blurry on what's going on there, but it seems it's got more repressive, and the hostility has flared up there more. It seems although Hamas support has collapsed in Gaza in the last several months. But
Actually, it's funny that you brought that up. I was about to mention that. I can't remember if it was the West Bank, but bizarrely enough, the biggest beneficiary was polling, obviously, is the PLO. If they were to hold an election tomorrow, Hamas wouldn't win it, not even remotely. Hamas would be crushed and destroyed, because I would not be surprised if Hamas is blamed among Palestinians. Obviously, while there's an important need to hold up a front that holds Israel centrally responsible, but I think fundamentally under the surface, even within Palestinian society in Gaza anyway itself, the West Bank might be a different story potentially, having been separated from the direct brunt of this so far. At the very least, Hamas wouldn't get anything. It looks like it would be severely punished. To actually to be able to drive a majority of Palestinians in Gaza back to the PLO, I mean, it have to be pretty extreme, right? It seems like this might have done it potentially.
It's really exposed that Hamas, if it gets to the point where Hamas actually has to govern, this sort of thing is the alternative, right? The struggle. I'm curious what both of you think. Did they overestimate their capacities, or were they in sort of a desperate situation where they had to spiral things into the struggle?
I think more the latter. There's pretty excellent Wall Street Journal coverage on this. I think Sinwar was betting that Israel would be more bogged down than it was by its conflicts with Hezbollah and with Iran. And ultimately, he must have been pretty disappointed when he had his arm blown off. But
I mean, the last thing that Hamas, or really, I shouldn't say Hamas, the last thing Palestinians should count on is the Arab states helping them at all. Because the entire issue has been exploited by the Arab states as a thorn in Israel's side. So why would they want to resolve it and help Palestinians?
Also, every other military in the region sucks. So,
right,
what help are they going to get?
Yeah.
I mean, how many times do you have to get your ass kicked? In this sense, really. I mean, it happened multiple times. That's ultimately why there was a stitch-up with Israel's immediate neighbors, at least on the western and eastern end, and ultimately leading to the Abraham Accords.
Right. I'm more speaking. They don't want the refugees. That's what.
No, they don't. They don't.
They don't want the refugees, and that's sort of goes back to the point I was making about not having the issue be settled was sort of in the political interest of everybody.
Right, and I guess the Accords have they complicated that. I do think that they were important as to like why Hamas was desperate enough to launch October 7th too. David, what do you think?
I think that it was done out of desperation, but we got to factor in the attenuation of the political sphere, right? Crazy solutions, quote unquote, like this It's not just desperation. In some ways, these solutions seem to run out of the rational control of the political actors in the situation. So they were looking for an out desperately, and any kind of rational thing would say, this is not an out, this is suicide. They're able to convince themselves, spiraling towards, there's a gravitational effect.
Something that did occur to me recently was comparing it perhaps to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah,
I wondered if they wound up trapped by their external political decisions and the radicalism of their own political logic, really.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Basically, this erupted. I think this is the strange thing is when you look back, this seemed to erupt out of a period where, in actual fact, the whole conflict was as static and dead as it has ever been. In fact, so static and dead, it had moved completely off everyone's attention and front pages. That's the biggest thing the Trump administration achieved. Effectively, it just kind of like by moving the embassy and doing and engaging in the Abraham Accord process. Effectively, it just kind of sidelined the whole issue. And what it effectively left Hamas to do is, maintain this kind of kabuki theater of conflict with Israel, but it finally left to do with one thing, which was to govern. And that was absolutely lethal for such a corrupt, politically self-interested,
authoritarian,
and nasty kind of government. And so, unsurprisingly, prior to this breaking out, their fortunes internally among Palestinians were plummeting badly. It's not like they had a very strong social base again amongst them per se. The options about which political force you're going to support is fairly they're mandated simply by the nature of the social conditions imposed by the occupation to a large degree. It's not like there's a whole bunch of political parties you could choose from. And the PLO had exhausted any possibility of credibility being restored. So effectively, they're defaulting to Hamas. But
right, they kind of ran as the anti-corruption thing in the 90s, really.
That's right. All those factors. It probably gives you a sense of how extreme, in actual fact, their governance problem, the fact that they had a hold on power, and the fact that, for instance, the questions were now being more directed to them. The questions, for example, of developing Gazan society, advancing life chances, so on and so forth. There's only so much that you can deflect onto the occupation when it comes down to direct domestic, quote unquote, questions of governance that answers social interests.
And I think too, there was sort of a contradiction between that and their own radical posturing, because of that in itself led to the occupation stonewalling them, or stonewalling development. Or not the occupation, really the, because I guess technically, what do you call it, an occupation? It's more like a walling off of Gaza, really.
Yeah, I think it's still technically considered to be occupation, but I mean, because they're controlling they control all the means of ingress and egress, but it's a siege effectively in some ways, isn't it? Really a permanent siege.
Right, and Hamas had to create those conditions effectively to prove its mettle as a radical insurgent group in a way, really. But that runs into the problem of governing. Are they a governing power, or are they a radical resistance movement?
Exactly. And the question became more and more, seeing as the conflict effectively was in this kind of, had actually ended up in kind of amber. The question became more and more of how well they performed as a governing entity. Not well, not well at all. And it just seems to me, because of that question arose more and more as them as an issue. I think internally for the Hamas as a political, internally for Hamas as, well, it's even to its extent you could say that the Palestinian political sphere in Gaza and Hamas are the same thing, like a one-to-one thing. But I'd say they're pretty close. It strikes me as becoming more and more of a crisis among the political elites crisis of identity, I guess, for them, but it's a crisis of their political vocation. They themselves start to have existential crisis about their roles as radicals and as a radical resistance, their existential destiny. And that's what I mean about it arising out of the attenuation and the not just desperation, but a kind of radicalization, quote unquote, that arises out of their own identity crisis about them getting admired as a governing entity, as opposed to, again, a radical resistance.
Yeah. I mean, I think of Giroud talking about this a little bit, maybe about some months ago. I think he floated that. I guess Marx talked about a class of like permanent agitators.
Mm.
And it feels like an entity like Hamas is kind of stuck between that and becoming a proper political class.
Yeah.
And in a way, the war was about trying to it was about trying to break out of that contradiction, really. Only to lead to Hamas's probable. I mean, I don't know if they're extinct, but I don't see a great future for Hamas after this, really. I don't know what their strength is on the West Bank right now, but at least in Gaza, it's pretty wiped out.
I'd be pretty shocked if it was good in the West Bank. I'd be pretty shocked. I don't think it was ever as strong as it was in Gaza, let alone now.
I think it had a spike in the early days of the war or the early months of the war. I don't know what it looks like now. I'd have to look at polling.
The thing about the West Bank, it can be more militant because it's more attenuated from this kind of conflict. So I think you'll find, for example, that when it's measured, I'm pretty certain this is the case, it tends to be more hardline, as it were. But again, I'd be shocked. Also, too, like stuff like Hamas being in a kind of roundabout way, but being expelled from
Qatar, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's a sense in which I think like the rats from an the rats kind of abandoning ship on this as well, because for whatever reason, whatever the strategic calculation that Hamas thought would arise out of this, the sheer degree in which the Israeli army has just pretty much flattened and devastated Gaza and the Strip, and has pretty much been carrying out a wholesale kind of terror campaign to try and force displacement. That's what I really think, because it's not fleeing. There's nowhere to flee to, but to forcibly displace almost that entire population. And may I say, they're very close to achieving that. It seems to me, the catastrophe that they've been left with, like countries like Qatar, and that if they're the ones who expect to rebuild this, if they're the ones that's going to fall on to rebuild Gaza, I don't think I would be particularly enamored with Hamas either. After all this, I think they projected in order to get back to the standard of living or the conditions prior to the October attack, it would take something like nearly 300 years or something. The sheer degree of de-development has just been astonishing.
I guess my question is, I don't know where the Trump administration is going to approach this independently, but I also wonder if I have to wonder if actually, if I was Trump looking at this, personally, I would try to use Iran as sort of leverage over both Israel and Hamas. I would try to use détente with Iran as a way to trap both, really. I feel like it forces... I think the thing is, it would force Netanyahu to heel, or whoever's really in charge, really, to heel in terms of the Israeli government. It would force them to heel while looking like you're supporting them. But it sort of cuts off whatever patronage Hamas had or has.
It certainly seems like Iran has been willing to play along.
It does, but I also feel like
it
puts Israel in an awkward position if the U.S. is making deals with Iran in the middle of all this.
Right.
I mean, this is the thing. Each side's trying to undermine the other. Like each side is trying to undermine all the other sides at the same time, which is why it ends up being such a sort of like a snake's nest. But I guess one of the questions I want to ask you guys is: there's a kind of split on this. Some, I think, see this as Israel as one. Right, this attack has created a situation where the asymmetry in the conflict has finally determinately swung in Israel's favor. And then, of course, the left.
Well, the left's line there seems to be that Israel is both committing a genocide and is going to surely lose. That doesn't square.
The thing I wonder about for myself, it's not for the reasons the left seem to be, because it's not based really in any kind of assessment. It's more moral, right? It's more like Israel will lose because it has to lose, because it would be immoral for it to win. It seems to be the source of like why Palestinian resistance will eventually overcome Israel. What I'm more wondering about are interpretations of Netanyahu's actions, which see him as trying to solve, quote unquote, or crush Palestine once and for all. What does it mean to crush Palestine? When Sharon evacuated the Gaza Strip, it always struck me is that he may be alone among Israeli leaders was looking towards a plan for a quote unquote Israeli solution to the conflict, which would basically be you would evacuate the Gaza Strip and then you would slowly but surely deport Palestinians from the West Bank to Gaza until such a point as their population in Gaza reached a low enough level that you could annex it unilaterally and not have the internal democratic problem that would arise by having percent of the population. It's a very large minority, where if the Palestinians in the West Bank were enfranchised and they were able to form a league of interests with Israeli Arabs, I think it would bring them very close to 50-50, I think, in terms of their power to influence the vote internally. The thing is, that struck me as the only way in which, if you think about it, right, Israel could solve the Palestinian problem. Effectively, you have this sort of micro-state, which effectively becomes the Palestinian state. The West Bank is incorporated, and you avoid apartheid by having low enough numbers of Palestinians to be able to annex it and not have to worry, per se, about the internal democratic instability that would rise.
Are you trying to ask if we think Israel has a plan? I don't think they really have a long-term plan.
What I mean is that this is why I'm saying there was nothing particular to say that Sharon himself this was a plan that he had orchestrated. It just struck me that seems to me like sort of an animating logic. Not that you could articulate it, because it would be definition, it's ethnic cleansing, right? Like, I mean, if you have an outright plan stated down like that, I mean, you might as well be signing documents that will get you thrown to the Hague. But what I find interesting about this is basically, what has Netanyahu done? Well, he's reversed that possibility, right? If that was the plan. Now, Gaza's back under Israeli administration. There's no outside to send Palestinians to. On top of that as well, they've totally ruined the internal
resistance,
internal self-management and governments, right? So if, for instance, they were to occupy it, which I don't think they want to, who's responsible for rebuilding? I mean, the Palestinian Authority doesn't have money of its own, really, right? And it seems to me like more what they seem to be angling for is annexing effectively half of the Gaza Strip, including Gaza City, and forcing the Gazan population into a kind of permanent displacement, which creates pressure to resettle them internationally. It seems like that's the only thing, if you were trying to draw a rational kind of goal or plan out of this, because unlike with Gaza as it stood, if they're in a constant, permanent, literal refugee camp rather than built-up environment with constant problems of food, water, utilities, so on and so forth, disease, it seems like it would create international pressure to have to resettle. But the Arab states, they've gone a long time without doing that.
I don't see like a Palestinian refugee mass displacement, really. I just don't see displacements outside of the Strip. I don't think anybody wants to take them. I remember seeing stuff about the Israelis being so desperate they're like hitting up the Congo for a settlement. It was getting quite absurd, really.
And the thing is, because the politics that are played with the Palestinian population by the Arabs, it's too integral to them. And so, I mean, that's why the whole thing, it's why outside of the Jewish population, right, you've never had a refugee population that's been in existence for as long as the Palestinians have. It just sort of strikes me, though, straight after the attack, the majority response from the Israeli population was absolute fury at the Netanyahu government. The top response wasn't fury about Hamas. It was fury at the failure of the Israeli state to do the one thing that it's meant to be good for, which is protect right. Israelis from being...
It blew up, it blew up the gambit that Netanyahu had been running on for the last, I don't know how many years, really.
Right.
Like the whole domestic tranquility, that was basically the whole line for the last 20 years, ever since the end of the Second Intifada, really. right?
Yeah. So Netanyahu strikes out, getting himself out of that seriously devilish crisis that he was in. He struck back in a wildly disproportionate, certainly understating it fashion. I don't think Netanyahu's had a plan. What I think his thing has been to do is to strike with force. He runs up against the limits of applying force, then you apply more force, but in a different direction. In other words, chaotifying the situation until such time as an exit appears out of the disorder that you've created. That seems to me, in some ways, if you had to give a kind of logic to what Netanyahu's doing, that seems more opposite to me than he has some plan, like he has a really worked out plan that's going to, like he step by step, he's going to be able to solve the Palestinian question in Israel because even if this is the case, even as I said, if they do display, even if the result is they annex half of the Gaza Strip, and by doing that have now created this kind of permanently displaced encampment in the rest, I mean, as much pressure, quote unquote, as that's meant to create on the international community, there are a lot of Palestinians, right? Again, it's the practical question. How does this get solved for Israel? As much as for the Palestinians, what's victory look like?
I've been wondering that myself, really. That's also why I've wondered, how does Trump administration even deal with this, really? Obviously, there is the answer of just have the Israelis, what they want, but even that doesn't really solve it, because I don't think the Israelis know what they want.
Imagine what the Israeli state wants is for the Palestinian population of both the West Bank and Gaza to be expelled from the territory and taken in as refugees around the world in large enough numbers that whatever remnant remained was manageable by the Israeli state. But they don't even take their own claims about how anti-Semitic the international community is seriously, in that regard. And they also don't seem to realize too that it's anti-Arab animus here actually works against them as much as anything, as much as anti-Semitism does. Because, I mean, what I'm saying is the more that, for example, they form a league with Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism elsewhere, the more they create the hostility to Arab immigration, quote unquote, and Arab refugees resettlement, which is the only thing that, that's what they want, I assume, you know what I mean? That's what they're after.
In these cabinet picks that you have in the news, we have both Marco Rubio, who ties into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a very pro-Israel stance. But we also have Tulsi Gabbard as the pick for Director of National Intelligence, which is a very interesting outcome because Tulsi Gabbard was put apparently on a terrorist watch list not too long ago by the current administration, and now she's going to be the boss of the people who put her on that watch list.
Do you remember when Hillary Clinton called her a Russian asset? That was pretty fun.
I do remember that. No, Gabbard was driven out of the Democratic Party in some sense as a Russian spy, supposedly.
Or even just generally speaking, a heretic. Or generally speaking, they couldn't retain a lot of their more maverick figures. I don't think the auction existed for them in that period. And Trump has vacuumed up these motley Democrats a little bit.
Gabbard is interesting because in 2020, her campaign did have a certain appeal to, first of all, independents, Republicans, that sort of thing. But it also, historically important in that it really tanked Harris's campaign. And this is something that maybe is a bit memory hold in the media at this point. But Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign ended in 2019 because, in large part, though also I think she would have been defeated regardless. But Tulsi Gabbard really hit Harris on her relationship to nonviolent offenders as an attorney general, which especially in 2020.
Certainly torpedoed that boat, that's for sure.
Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep
Thank you,
cash bail
Congresswoman.
system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Right. I mean, it's a historic moment in that debate. I think it deserves a little bit more recognition. And then you have Gabbard running a 2020 primary suggesting let's run on something other than anti-Trump, right? But it didn't really take. And I understand that. I mean, the Democrats at the time, I think even their voters, wanted somebody who could stand up to Trump. And I think it became a competition between Bernie and Biden over that. And I think we know Bernie sort of failed the test in certain ways because he could really only sort of stay there in his lane and go into his shell and repeat his economic populist message, right? He didn't really show how he would confront Trump in a one-on-one cage match. Whereas Biden could sort of get angry and, you know, call it all malarkey. Gabbard was offering, what if we don't run on anti-Trump entirely, right? Which that didn't take in 2020.
Right. I guess how this sort of relates to what is she going to do in that position as well?
Well, her orientation, unlike a lot of where the Democratic Party went, I think in a reactionary way towards Trump, her orientation is not interventionist in a foreign policy sense. And I think she also is much more libertarian on civil rights issues than a lot of people in the Democrat or Republican Party really of prominence. Assuming she's confirmed, she will be in charge of the intelligence community for the US. I mean, I'm sure they've got all their sort of corridors and things where decisions are made without as much oversight, and that'll probably remain the case. But it's just quite fascinating and disruptive to have a figure who was very recently persecuted by I'm not going to call it the deep state, right? But by whatever you want to call it. And now they're the boss. So it's assuming this goes through Congress successfully. Gabbard's a very interesting choice for this role. I mean,
It's interesting you put it that way because there is a parallel there between her and Gaetz.
right.
The difference being, I guess, whether or not, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is not a Russian asset or whatever the reason she was put on the terrorist watch list, for Christ's sake. Gaetz, I don't know. I'd have to look into it more, but there is a parallel there of, those who have kind of been at the receiving or the pointy end of these state apparatuses actually being appointed to run them.
It's interesting how far she'll go. It's an interesting question, right? I don't think we'll see anything along the lines of that sort of 70s reckoning with the intelligence agencies and MK Ultra type of things.
But I'd assume that Trump, in appointing her, is wanting to appoint someone that can get to the bottom of the way in which the quote-unquote deep state has been weaponized against him as well. I assume that anything's going to come out of it. I assume that would be why. I could be wrong, and I think probably choosing her, outside of the fact that her competence is so clear, is the fact actually in some ways it's her, I think probably is the fact that she's actually removed in many ways from the administration in a way which has integrity, let's put it that way, I think. So that Trump can trust her. I wouldn't so far as he does trust anyone.
Gabbard, actually, you don't have to count on her loyalty, which is what makes her loyal, is an earnest opponent of the military-industrial complex.
In that sense, also, too, she couldn't be more different, but that reminds me a little bit of Kennedy in that respect, too. Kennedy, whatever you might say about him, he's earnest about his crusade against the FDA and vaccines or whatever, but he's genuinely earnest about that. It would fit someone if that would fall into line with Gabbard. When Gabbard was running as a Democrat, and one of the things I'm most curious to see about with her future as well is, remember, she ran really quite on very quote unquote far left positions. She was for a universal healthcare scheme, one that was actually the smartest of the lot so far as these ideas went. So I'm curious to see how she navigates that in terms of the future of the Republican Party. Obviously, she doesn't see it as too much of an obstacle, which is interesting. It says a lot about the way in which she understands the Republican voters, let's put it that way, at this point. Thinking back to that primary too, one of the things, especially the Bernie left at that time, seized on with her, they were fetishized and were obsessed with her orientation towards Modi in India. They're very good at using some issue, could be foreign policy. In the case of RFK, it would be the vaccines, regardless of whether or not it's a shit stance or a reactionary stance. The tendency is to isolate this kind of island or something, or find that with this position within what otherwise might be an extremely progressive overall approach, worldview. And effectively it all disappears beneath that or behind that, you know, as if Bernie, for example, Bernie's orientation towards Israel in practical terms, right, would end up any different from, you know, Gabbard's in practical terms towards India had she become president. I'm just focusing on this because her anti-political retrenchment of the poles of the political sphere in terms of what she was proposing, that she could be, for example, someone who is both hostile to the military-industrial complex, and yet not anyone would mistake for a dove. That she could be supportive, quote unquote, of an authoritarian foreign government like Modi's, and yet be radically civil libertarian in her approach to domestic, or not even just domestic really, but like her general approach actually when it comes to individual freedoms. Like those complications in some ways, that's what had to be managed away. The idea that, you know, that there was an alternative that kind of could stand outside the frame of the locked political kind of the slate of positions that you get if you know, that you have to buy if you're going to back any particular, you know, part of that party. If you back Bernie, you have to back all of these other things that you necessarily stand for. If you back Clinton, you got to back all these other things that you do. Like for the one thing that you want, you know, you got to accept the 5 things that you don't. That sort of thing, if you get what I mean. When she's been accused of being a Russian asset and so on and so forth, is that there's an unpredictability and a kind of a disruptive independence to the kind of way in which her orientation towards foreign policy, like, would have retrenched the US had it been, you know, realized in the way that she would want to pursue it. The thing that strikes me though is that someone like her being the National Intelligence Director, I think raises a lot of questions. The source, for instance, when Clinton made that claim that she was a Russian asset, outside of the fact that she just made it up wholesale, which is not, I wouldn't put it past her, just literally to say it. Where would the so-called proof or data for that come from? Well, the National Intelligence Agency is one assuming is where that would ultimately sort of have been generated or cooked up, whatever so-called basis there was to that. And I think it's just interesting then in that case to see that, or to wonder about what Gabbard might do in terms of like the national intelligence agencies as these manufactories of like proof for completely and utterly bullshit, like political claims that have been used so far to kind of try and obstruct anti-politicians and trying to, you know, they're used against Trump, used against her, used against Bernie, you know, and Bernie not being an anti-politician, but I'm saying anyone that kind of is kind of disruptive to whatever degree of the terms of the kind of current political class setup. And I guess that also too, it makes me wonder as well about the degree to which the consensus around Russia will be disrupted. I mean, when I say, I mean for and against. I don't necessarily mean the consensus like in support of Ukraine. I also mean the way in which the right or the faction of the right that like is sort of was more. It's really more about them being anti-Ukrainian, I think, than pro-Putin. But about whether about the things that section are kind of basing their arguments on. The kind of, I wonder whether, for instance, the information that we see come out of or what's declassified and what's considered to be classified and so on and so forth, if there's a change in that, which disrupts them as well, and I guess shifts the entire landscape of questions like Ukraine, Russia, and maybe even Israel, Palestine as well.
So before we wrap up, I do want to get into Andy Kim again, because I actually do find his emergence to be quite interesting. This is a great New Yorker article from March of this year that gets into how he's emerged as a senatorial candidate. It goes a little bit into his background too. Apparently he knew Pete Buttigieg. She worked in the Obama administration, but he emerged as an outsider to New Jersey politics. And it gets into how he took on something called the county line, which was basically a prominent spot in a New Jersey primary ballot. That effectively, if that doesn't guarantee your victory, it certainly helps. And it's very much something that's dictated by the sort of county Democratic committees that effectively ran things in the New Jersey Democratic Party for God knows how long. And Kim ran against that. He was going to run against the sitting governor's wife, the first lady, until she dropped out.
Phil Murphy, yes.
Yeah. He ran on a lawsuit to overturn the county line, which was successful. It was overturned, I think, in the fall this year, so a couple months ago. And what I find fascinating about this article is it gets at like how his campaign was seen as an insurgency in the midst of the crumbling machinery of the New Jersey Democratic Party.
I want to read this aloud, actually, this section. New Jersey is the only state in the nation with this type of bracketed ballot design. According to Julia Sass-Rubin, a public policy professor at Rutgers, a candidate who gets the line enjoys a double-digit advantage over the competition. The line is also a barrier to entry for new politicians and those perceived as outsiders. It breeds patronage. Party leaders have used their power over the line to extract jobs, government contracts, and donations. Kim came out against the county line shortly before he declared his Senate run. Last month, he filed a federal lawsuit claiming that it is unconstitutional.
And one of the ironies of this, too, that I find interesting is that he actually wound up benefiting from the county line once Murphy dropped out. But he ran the lawsuit anyway to abolish it on principle. Smart. Very smart, I think.
Doesn't sound like a politician very much, I will say. That is interesting.
I find his links to the Obama administration interesting as well. Apparently, he studied at Oxford with Buttigieg, which he doesn't have some sort of allegiance to Obama's technocratic.
Yeah, I'm wondering, could someone from the Obama administration have actually learned something about how Obama got to power? That's amazing. If it's actually the case. Yeah, wow.
Right. And I guess what I find interesting about him, too, he did win against a Republican to get in power. So he seems to know how to win a tough district. And he did overperform Harris in New Jersey overall this year.
Which is also such a reflection of the Harris-Trump campaign as well, that New Jersey, I wouldn't quite call it competitive, but really the margins that Harris won by in Jersey, fairly slim for the state.
It's yeah, no, absolutely. And
even that one gubernatorial candidate, Jack Citarelli.
Jack Citarelli, yeah, he overperformed a couple years ago.
Exactly.
I mean, Citarelli is not really a national Republican. He's more moderate than they are, so that probably helped. But the fact that he could almost win still kind of showed the issues that Phil Murphy was running into. Apparently, I think
it's similar to a Lee Zeldin thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Murphy was angling for the DNC chair recently. I don't see that going anywhere. But anyway, I want to get back into this. Here's an interesting paragraph, too. It was unusual, to say the least, for a Jersey politician to enter a high-profile race before consulting the party apparatus. he had the audacity to announce his run without asking for permission. On top of that, Kim made his campaign all about the county line. It was a brilliant maneuver. It piggybacked on a years-long campaign by reformers and sharpened the distinction between Murphy and himself. The two are basically indistinguishable on other issues: the welfare state, Israel, and abortion rights. Basically,
you know what? This is his wall. He
It
made
is.
a lot of anti-politicians, they have their wall, right? So for a Democrat, technocratic, maybe anti-politician, it's a very difficult title to bestow, right? But
yeah, we'll have to see how he goes. But he has
We'll have to
potential, I
see.
think.
But to have that single issue that you use as this wrecking ball against the establishment in that way, just their refusal to do a thing that you can sort of portray as this obvious thing that needs to be done for social good. It's striking.
Right. And I guess we're also seeing beyond this, we've seen the collapse of like New Jersey machine politics this year, pretty spectacular. I need to follow up on it, but like, wasn't George Norcross indicted? And he was like the guru of South Jersey for how many years?
Well,
So
and you
that's
saw
collapsing.
Menendez dropped as well.
Yep. And Norcross too. That's big. I mean, he kind of did just run in on this tide of like, this scum that run this state, I'm different. His first congressional run, like they try to portray him as an outsider. The congressional campaign even sounded somewhat racist against him, really. But like, I think clearly Kim like tapped into something where he was not where he had an anti-political streak. And I think what I think they didn't understand is that New Jersey has a pretty large Korean population as well, as far as I know. I don't know if that district did, but I think that sort of, I wonder if Kim could even tap into that really as a demonstration of I'm me. I'm this type of guy you might see in New Jersey. I'm a Korean American dad, but I'm also against corruption.
He's likable. I mean, what I've seen, he's likable.
I think we saw this with Obama, really.
It's intriguing.
The authority that gave him. Yeah. I don't know. But David, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I find this guy quite interesting, actually. I wonder if we'll hear more from him.
At this point, no. I have to read up more about him directly, I think. But it's interesting just to hear what you guys have to say about it. The fact that he continued with the suit to find the county line unconstitutional when the fortunes had reversed in his favor because of it. And you've got to remember too, once he'd become the candidate, again, it's not a lock state, but once he'd become the candidate, he could have gone back on that and used partisan capture to have gotten himself into power. It's a big sign, a big sort of indication that there's something there. So I'm going to look into it more. It's very interesting.
It is intriguing. I mean, there's a lot of asterisks here. We need to see what happens next. He's a fairly new figure to the national stage, and this has really been what elevated him to the national stage. As well, we also need to see he clearly has some understanding, or he has realized anti-politics as a force. But what is his relationship to it in the long run, right? This could be, because really, someone who understands it could also end up being one of its great opponents. And that is always a possibility. But then
it's also too, I mean, not that we have time to get into it, I think, in this episode, but remember in 2020, there were a number of, let's say, nascent, not proto, but nascent anti-political figures, like Buttigieg, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Buttigieg was not an anti-politician, but his initial pitch and entrance into the scene had elements of it that he tapped into, that he seemed to understand, that he picked up, I think, from the Obama administration. But very quickly was that subsumed. Beto O'Rourke was another one. But Beto O'Rourke, and he was actually much more explicit and seemed to be much more coherent, but then very quickly was subsumed by realigning himself with the Democrat political class, and by doing so destroyed himself. And that's the interesting thing about this, is that when these figures do rise, because they've started to show that they're flirting with anti-politics, whether they know it or not, they're very soon crushed if they move back into alignment, much more so than if a politician they hadn't tried to dabble in it. They're punished, right? I think for some sense for promising something that they weren't. So likewise with Kim, I'm assuming having gone out as far as he has on this limb, if he doesn't get that his self-interest is definitely in continuing to pursue it, well, I imagine the same thing will befall him that's befallen pretty much all the other pseudo or nascent or actual outright anti-politicians that have turned and reversed themselves in this front, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And one person I wanted to bring up, actually, because this is relevant to what I was talking about on, oh, by the way, everybody, I appeared on J.G. Michael's Parallax Views, and I discussed anti-politics on it. And one of the things that he brought up to me was, I guess he has a skepticism on anti-politics because he seems to see modern politics and people's relationship to it as purely spectacle. And I wish I brought this up, but Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, what I find interesting about him is that he seems to understand, he will use the line of like not being a typical politician, but he seems to see it as purely an aesthetic exercise or with maybe a little bit of hippie punching on the side. I don't think he really gets it. But it's an example, I think, of somebody. I don't know what your thoughts are. That seems to be what I've seen of his pitch.
I actually the broader topic of about approaching anti-politics as a kind of aesthetic with no I don't want to say policy content, but no bite anyway. No actual bite against politics. This is something I think we should come back to in a different episode because there is something important about this. I imagine it'll become more important too, the more that particularly the left now are forced, against whether they like it or not, to try and deal, quote unquote, with what this last election has slapped them across the face with as hard as possible.
There's a difference between politicians that use anti-politics and an anti-politician that actually is disruptive in how we see this even classically, historically. I mentioned this even in the podcast with J.G. Michael, that the new right used anti-politics, but for a very political project. Certainly, I think we could see more politicians start to consciously use it now, but to sort of channel things back into maybe they think they could conjure a social base out of doing this, but they can't.
They may well think too. They may think about anti-politics in political terms, like for example, that it's a political strategy, a pitch, a something that you can exploit to be able to, you know, game the population into forming a political base for you, but on anti-political principles. If that's their approach, not only do they not understand it, but it will eventually. It might work possibly for a time, but it won't last. I'd probably say that it would turn out to be even more volatile than running on a direct, just political line. To me, a lot still goes back to thinking about Clinton, Hillary Clinton, as still being the most formidable. I don't care about 2020 and what they've claimed about Biden. It had nothing to do with Biden. But the most formidable opponent to Trump that he's run against so far was Clinton, and she was the most straightforwardly political.
This does get into what Pat talked about too, with how the Harris campaign began to shape itself in weirdly Trump-like ways. It leaned heavily into personalism. It engaged in like rather brazen lying.
What the biggest problem for Trump this term is going to be Trumpism, which I'm sure we'll talk about and get into as a distinction in other episodes. But this, in some ways, the so-called resistance, or the fact that he didn't get his way with his own candidate in the Senate, that strikes me as a big victory for Trumpism against Trump. And whereas it might seem, for example, Scott was the more Trumpist, quote unquote, of the two, it actually strikes me more along the lines that he would have been much more pliable to Trump's authority, which is a different thing altogether, and therefore not as much of an ideologue in actual practice in terms of what he ended up allowing and not allowing through as what you have now. And so it'll be interesting to see whether a conflict erupts between Trump and Trumpism as represented in the Senate in that respect.
I feel like that might be the case, especially with the House majority being split. I mean, what is he going to ram through, really? I think an immigration bill, he might manage to do just because the Democrats are so defeated on that he probably could unite the entire Republican coalition on it, but it's still tricky. Taxes, okay, Yeah, that's one thing you get. Republicans
Well, they
to agree on,
barely got that through.
that's true, actually. Yeah. So I don't know.
But it is a different party at this point. Not necessarily stronger though, but it is a different party. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's tough. I don't know. Like that's.
I mean, I wonder if he'll try his Dreamers trade again with the Democrats. You know, there's more likelihood.
They might not torpedo it based on purely political obstructionary reasons. They might actually not play games with the lives of all those,
I don't think they could get away with it again. That's kind of the issue. I think the Democrats are so defeated on immigration that, yeah, could they get away with just obstructing any comprehensive immigration thing? Or
it's so much more likely too that even if they were or did insist that they won't be able to hold the line, that Democrats will break off.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. Especially with, I don't know, who's the House leadership now? Jeffries?
I think Pelosi, she was formidable. There's no doubt about that.
I think we talked about this before. Factional liquefaction in the Democratic Party, especially if Trump actually does have a remotely successful second term. How are they going to relate to that? Let me see if I can share this one. A vote against San Francisco's family. Oh, this is related to Willie Brown.
So this is sort of following on your Andy Kim research. We've also got this one.
Yeah, so basically this Nepo baby decided to run as an outsider to, I guess, the old Willie Brown machine that's been running things in San Francisco since the Stone Age. Daniel Lurie, his name is. And there's some interesting choice quotes here. That's where Daniel Lurie comes in. He appealed to voters largely because he's not in the city family. The Levi Strauss heir, philanthropist and founder of the anti-poverty nonprofit Tipping Point, has never been a city supervisor, department head, or commissioner, or held any other political office. He thus became the outsider candidate. Other mayoral hopefuls criticized his lack of direct experience in government. That became one of his.
Sorry to interrupt. You think they would have
points.
learned by now about criticizing the direct experience in government? You think if there's that they would have learned? But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
You would think after all of this time, after
the most qualified candidate, etc., you think, but no, not even that.
I like this quote. I wanted to see the corrupt city family broken apart and smashed to smithereens, says Rabble. They don't look out for constituents, only for themselves. They created a cabal and weren't focused on what's best for the city. Daniel Lurie is their nightmare. He's not controllable by insiders. I wonder what's going on here. What do you guys think?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a little less to go on here in terms of this person's grasp of anti-politics than Kim, for example, because with Andy Kim,
right, absolutely. He explicitly talks about it.
With Andy Kim, in our last episode, we went through him actually talking directly to Trump voters and garnering from the things they said that they had a direct hostility towards politics as politics, regardless of political party, right? And he seemed to process that information. This seems to be, I'm the outsider to the insider, establishmentarianism, that kind of thing, which could just take a populist valence. You're still seeing something parallel about the breakup of old political machines. And so even if not this is an interesting point to make about anti-politics in general, perhaps, is that the effect of anti-politics coming out of society on the political sphere is not necessarily, and also the effect of political breakdown internally, right, is not necessarily always the elevation of an anti-politician into power. It can be also this secular process over time of political breakdown.
Right. I mean,
to add to that, actually, the thing that strikes me, and I'm just looking at the way in which she phrases this in the quote. Daniel Lurie is their nightmare. He's not controllable by insiders. It strikes me too, as well, that so long, for instance, as a candidate is disruptive and can't be assimilated into the actual working mechanisms of, what's called here a cabal, or the corrupt city family, simply voting them in is to use them as a kind of anti-political weapon, whether or not they themselves are super anti-political. it's very much about how the public, right, uses them as a means of expressing their antagonism to politics, whether or not those candidates, and you'll see this a lot in the way in which the public is yo-yoing, quote unquote, back and forth, like in Germany at the moment, the right is supposedly rising, quote unquote. Well, we'll see. It's liable to fall apart. And it exactly because this is the whole thing. And then the polarities shift, and all of a sudden the Social Democrats seem to rise again. And then there'll be a whole bunch of stuff about, there's been a leftward turn in society. No, it's the antagonism that is directing things,
Absolutely. And I think too, like, I mean, we've seen a lot of problems with like in urban municipal management ever since 2020, which we can get into it at some other point. But it's gotten to the point that, we've seen Republicans get elected or independents get elected as DAs in Multnomah County, that's Portland, Oregon, and Seattle. A Republican got elected as DA in Seattle. Like, how badly do you have to screw up?
Yeah, that is pretty crazy.
That is pretty, but like, you think of what happened 4 years ago, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It even gets into like why there was a pretty strong shift towards Trump in the greater New York area. I would think anyway, because I think there's a lot of there's fears of the old of the bad old days coming back. I think it's not even that like I don't even think it's that New York City itself is as mismanaged as a lot of these cities are, or that it even got hit by a crime spike as large as a lot of these other cities did. At least not violent crime. That isn't quite what happened. But I do think there's a lot of cultural fear, I think, in like the tri-state area of the bad old days coming back.
I think
because those bad old days were very bad. So
yeah, absolutely.
And there's something about dysfunction that might not just necessarily be expressed as crime.
Yes, that too. It could be the subway. Things don't work as well anymore because a lot of things seem kind of broken since the weird dysfunctionalities of the lockdown regime, really. And I do think that factors into things somewhat, even if they're not like expressed in like clear economic data. Or
I think there's also too, particularly when it comes to law and order issues, that there's hostility towards the idea of ideological experimentation. So, for instance, say something like bail reform, quote unquote. There are a lot of good reasons that you can present that as being in general social interests, but that's not the way that they really argue for something like bail reform. Bail reform is something that you have to push because it's it's the socially just thing to do. Therefore, when any particular problems arise out of it as a consequence of doing quote unquote the right thing, there's literally no argument to draw back on that shows the social benefits. More importantly, too, the whole thing probably hasn't even been orchestrated or organized with that in mind primarily. So it's been done more to satisfy a tick box of ideological requirements to meet a certain threshold of what would be considered to be socially just, emancipatory, so on and so forth, rather than, and more importantly too, not gamed out in a way to expecting the resistance that you're going to get in relation to the problems. If you want to do something that you consider to be right and better for society in the overall sense, but there are going to be contradictions that arise from it, then it's almost, there's an obligation upon you in advance to be able to plan for how you're going to cope with those contradictions. The left is just absolutely, completely an abrogation of its responsibility in that respect, above all, I would say, when it comes to its quote unquote progressive policies, and turns viciously and nastily on the public for what fundamentally is its own failure to be able to understand that these issues have to advance general social interest, or this is the kind of result that they can expect to get.